Welcome to today's Budget and Performance Committee meeting, where we will be discussing the 2022-23 GLA budget guidance. Can I start with the usual reminder to make sure that all electronic devices are switched to silent, and if you could keep them away from the microphones, that would be useful too. It's worth noting that today the London Assembly holds its first meetings following the end of the period of mourning. We look forward now to continuing our work of scrutinising the performance of the Mayor and serving Londoners under the reign of His Majesty King Charles III. Can I now ask our clerk, Paul Goodchild, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. No apologies for absence, but Assemblymember Harani will be joining us remotely.
Thank you, and welcome, Assemblymember Harani. Item 2, which is declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? It's noted, and I see no other interests. Item 3, can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 14th of July 2022 to be signed by me as a correct record? That's agreed. Item 4, can we note the completed and ongoing and closed actions arising from previous meetings of the committee? That's noted. So moving on to item 5, which is the budget guidance, which is our main item of business, which is the implications of the Mayor's budget guidance on the GLA's 23-24 budget and the Q1 22-23 performance of the GLA core. I'd like to welcome our guests. First, David Bellamy, Mayor's Chief of Staff, and also to note the work that you've been doing on Operation London Bridge. Thank you, that is appreciated. David Gallie, Executive Director of Resources, and Enver, who is Assistant Director of Group Finance and Performance for the GLA. I will start with a question to David Gallie. What's led to the increase in the overall total mayoral discretionary funding compared with last year's budget guidance?
Substantially, the funding levels assumed are essentially the same. There is a set of assumptions we've made around business rates, looking now at a business rates assumption of 2.5% and a council tax base increase of 1%. But within that, and the previous assumptions we made a year ago, really also around particularly the TfL increase in the precept on Band D, largely the numbers are unchanged.
Thank you. My next question was going to be about that TfL funding, so it's good to see that's wrapped in. In terms of the mayoral discretionary funding, against what criteria has it been allocated across the GLA group?
I think that's perhaps a question for David Bellamy rather than myself.
Yeah, so in terms of the difference between, because obviously if you go back to the budget guidance for 22-23 that we published last June-July time, obviously between that and the most recent budget guidance, we had a whole budget process. And so there were a number of changes that came through there, as David Gallie said, including decisions around council tax and also our base levels of funding. What we have now in this budget guidance is essentially the same allocations for 23-24 as were proposed in the final draft budget that the Assembly considered back in February. The difference being an additional allocation of £10 million to TfL, which the Mayor's due to announce what that's to be used for shortly.
So looking at that percentage spread, the way that's been split out, you're saying this is the same sort of formula that was applied previously?
No, I'm worried we're confusing two different things. So the changes, if you compare the two budget guidances, then what you will see is the effect of the budget process substantially, and then what you see, what you'll see is any further changes as part of the preparation of this budget guidance. But the budget, there's very little of those because largely the information we get that's material comes from billing authorities and government through the winter, and so the numbers are very close. in terms of what was in the final budget in February and what we have in this budget guidance. And the difference, as I say, is that just over £10 million allocation to TfL.
So what I'm sort of particularly thinking about is the decision to split across the different areas of the group. So I found that the MOPAC percentage allocation of 5% was quite interesting, because we saw in a previous meeting the MOPAC have still got quite a bit in reserves. So it was just trying to understand the thought process of the way that that's allocated across those different parts of the group.
I mean, on MOPAC in particular, it's really driven by the assumption on council tax. As you'd be aware, Chairman, the MOPAC effectively have a hypothecated element of the Mayor's precept, which effectively goes to them. So that becomes the core element of the funding. So it remains, again said, largely unchanged on the assumption we've made of MOPAC's precept going up by 1.99%.
Yeah, the figures I have, though, show for 23-24, and overall, at this stage we're assuming a percentage increase for MOPAC of 2.9% compared to their baseline funding for 22-23. So clearly we're working off different figures for some reason.
So this is the discretionary funding with the budget guidance. So if we look at the way that that increase has been spread, 5% of it has gone to MOPEC. Are we looking at that figure?
So I think
discretionary funding.
I think what you're doing is, as I say, comparing the numbers that were in the 22-23 budget guidance with the 23-24 budget guidance. Now, that's interesting if you want to talk about how accurate the budget guidance was in predicting what we learnt through the course of the budget process.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I don't think it's a valid comparison, because obviously the point of the guidance kick-starts the process, and we all learn lots more through it as information comes through from billing authorities, government takes decisions, etc. And so inevitably there will be differences through that period.
Okay. So have there been? So do you receive any representations from functional bodies as part of that process, specifically around the discretionary funding?
So I mean, we talk to functional bodies regularly. I have quarterly meetings as set out in the budget guidance with CFOs, and have other meetings as necessary in between. I know Enver and his team will meet with them usually monthly. So we absolutely have those discussions to try and get a good understanding of the process and their situation. But very much at this stage, there was very little that would say in terms of the budget guidance, we really should be moving money from organisation X and putting it into organisation Y. There's there remains a lot of uncertainty about the income levels we're going to have, and so in general, with the one exception for TfL that I've mentioned, we've put that we've basically just said continue working on the numbers that you had, and then through that work, in particular, I'm sure we'll touch on the impact of inflation, in particular energy price inflation, on each organisation. Then through the budget process, the Mayor can make some decisions as we get more clarity on what our level of income actually will be.
Okay. So, sorry if I'm being slow on the pickup here, David. What we're saying is, from the budget guidance, there is a standard criteria that's set, and then that's been applied each of the 2 years. And then if there's going to be any changes, that will be done retrospectively when there's more information comes in, especially with external factors like inflation.
Yeah. So we've taken the starting point of being where we finished the budget process in February. So we've started from there. We found that we had just over £10 million. Our current prediction is just over £10 million more than we assumed in that budget. And so the Mayor took a decision on where to put that in the guidance. And then there are some assumptions about how that uprates for later years, but that's incredibly indicative at this stage, because we've got such huge uncertainty about 23-24 income levels before we get on to anything else.
Okay, and that's an important point as well. So what structures are you putting in place to deal with some of those challenges that we're going to be facing in the next budget round?
So I guess it falls in, and David might want to say more, but it falls into the uncertainty about income and the challenges on expenditure. So the uncertainty about income, we've resolved one important aspect of that through concluding the funding deal for TfL with the government, which means that they are basically taking away the fares revenue risk. TfL still faces other income risks. For instance, if it got less income from advertising media, if there were a recession, but that's clearly a really big risk that has been successfully mitigated now for this financial year and the next financial year. There are other risks to income levels in terms of billing authorities and what figures they report, and so clearly David works closely with fellow members of the Society of London Treasurers to try and understand and anticipate what may happen there. And then obviously we talk to and lobby the government in terms of the decisions that they will need to make around business rates and council tax and things like that.
Okay.
Chairman, if I can add a couple of things to what David has just said. I think the other challenges also reflect on where we are in London's economy, I guess in particular emerging from COVID, but obviously that still remains a risk and a threat. Also around ultimately the impact that would have on tax receipts, and I guess in particular on TfL fares. The other thing underpinning it all, of course, is where we are with the government's promised changes, reforms to the local government finance system, in particular the business rates reset and fair funding formula reviews, and that's been a particular concern because clearly those have been challenges that we've had really for the whole of this decade have yet to be crystallised. But the assumption we're making is that given the advice previously we've had from government and from particularly the LGA, was that it's unlikely that the business rates reset or the fair funding reforms would come in before 25-26. The logic for that is that it's too late for that for the next financial year, 2023-24, and that given the government set out a 2-year settlement, and clearly depending on when there might be a general election as well, it's unlikely there would be any changes on reset and funding formula during 24-25. That's obviously a key assumption because clearly those changes could have material impact upon the GLA's level of resources.
Okay. So in terms of efficiencies, what efficiencies have been thought about and built into this model?
I mean, perhaps the most important one that we built in is obviously the work that David has particularly chaired in the Group Collaboration Board. So looking to ensure that we drive out where efficiencies we can from issues across the group. So for issues arising, say, from accommodation or energy, but a whole series of other programmes and projects that at some point we'll obviously be happy to talk the committee through in more detail. And I think that's been the one of the most significant changes and improvements that we've developed over the last couple of years in terms of genuinely driving the collaboration across all members of the group, which has begun, I would say, to deliver real efficiencies, not only non-cashable but also cashable ones, which have also been reflected in the budget guidance here, where we actually have, for the first time, been able to top slice resources from the control totals for each of the functional bodies to put the core programme and the core team working on collaboration on an ongoing sustainable basis rather than relying upon one-off business rates.
And part of finding and driving those efficiencies is being aware of having a relatively accurate idea of what the numbers are. And I know you've been doing work with improving reporting from functional bodies or standardising reporting from functional bodies. How has that helped you to understand performance better, and has that had any impact on some of the budget guidance work you're doing? I don't know if Enver might be a better place to answer that.
When we have the meetings that David Bellamy was referring to earlier, quite often in the detailed internal management reports that they give, the functional bodies actually explain the efficiencies and the transformation that they're all working on. So it varies from organisation to organisation, but I would say almost all of the functional bodies have got a transformation program and efficiency program ongoing at all times, and so we do actually capture that. We are aware of what their intentions are. Some cashable benefits take longer to crystallise. Some of them are not always cashable, but their effectiveness. So it comes up on a quarterly basis. I don't think those are things that are necessarily published because there could be sensitive information around commercial contracts or staff reductions or things like that. But internally, the internal management boards of those organisations do have that information.
So with that learning, taking the formula criteria that we have from the budget guidance to set the way that discretionary spending is allocated, there is still time in this process to adapt some of that, alter some of that, maybe redirect it to where it may be better served.
Yeah.
The MOPAC one, sorry David, the MOPAC one keeps jumping up because I think when we were looking at underspends last time, there was a surprising amount of I think it was revenue cost actually from MOPAC that was going into earmarked reserves, which had built up to about £500,000, I think.
So I think, yeah, with MOPAC, there's no doubt that there've been some delay. They have a very large capital programme, as we know, and there's no doubt that there've been some delays on that. Some of that, will be presumably timing around payments. Some of that may be more substantive about project progress. And that does feed through to the revenue account because, of course, if the capital expenditure isn't being made, then when that capital expenditure is supported by, enabled by borrowing, then that borrowing would likely be delayed, which then means that the interest costs that we would be showing in the revenue budget wouldn't be incurred. Yeah. So that's an example of how any delay on the capital side can feed through to the revenue budget, and so that there can be that interplay. To your general point, it would be wrong to suggest that the Mayor puts out the budget guidance and then on 25th of November some things drop into Enver's inbox, which are the budget submissions. Clearly, there's engagement during that process, because ultimately the Mayor has to look at the submissions and what is proposed. And when he puts out a consultation budget, usually shortly before Christmas, well, ultimately that's a judgment to say, is the balance of funding that we've proposed, which obviously will update based on any new information about income levels, is that appropriate, or is it the case that organisation A just has to have more money and we're going to fund that by taking a bit from B and C? Yeah.
Because, I mean, I'm doing this off the top of my head. This was a meeting a couple of months back, but the MOPAC capital programme has been delayed, but it's been delayed for quite some time now, hasn't it? So it's actually, when you're looking at these numbers, it's how does the performance of functional bodies, or their sometimes underperformance, how does that then relate to the way that the formula is applied? Does that have an impact on it? Is the sort of hub of the question. And
on your specific point, I'm really sure. We've already spoken to the new Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner of Police about the situation with their capital budget. So clearly they have a lot on what a first week to have, but they will undoubtedly be getting to grips with that. And the Deputy Mayor's speaking to them again about it tomorrow.
Okay, and I'm going to give David Gallie a free swing at this one, which is just to give us 3 points of things you've learned or could be improved from the 22-23 budget to just help with this process. And I know we've spoken about this offline.
I think the first thing is around constantly looking to improve our financial reporting, and I'm sure we'll come on to it later, but we are still in work in progress around that. So that's not only getting our information more timely and more accurate, but also automating that, because I think that's the route, I think, for some of the issues that you've touched upon, Chairman, around gearing in performance. I think the thing that we also need to kind of always bear in mind is that every budget here is different here, and I think in particular this year's budget, with inflation being so eye-watering, is going to be particularly difficult and different here. There's a whole set of different issues, I think, that you've started to touch on with the Chief of Staff now. So going back to the issue of MOPAC's reserves, I mean, that obviously gives MOPAC a greater capacity to handle inflationary pressures than, say, our MDCs, who effectively have only reliant upon a GLA reserve that we hold for both MDCs. So to me, I think it's just always having that sense of being able to respond to the unique circumstances. I think the final thing I'd say is I think we are always in this sort of dilemma of you rightly wanting to scrutinise us in the middle of a set of information which we don't have, and that when it does emerge, it's very late in the day. So I think for me, it's around trying to find genuinely the right balance for you to allow your scrutiny to be most effective, and therefore we use the statutory process in a way that allows us to set out the budget process to you, but also engages you when you can have most impact and effect in terms of looking at the detail. So I know obviously it's things we've talked offline. I think around thinking of the reality, and I suspect this year is going to be probably more difficult than the previous years, and that goes back to the fact that we have a new government. Obviously we've had potentially a kind of a 2-week delay because of the events over the last couple of days or so with the funeral. But it almost feels that even before that, we were likely to have a provisional settlement potentially just before Christmas or even into the new year. And I think the likelihood of having a late settlement has been increased, which of course then compounds all the problems we have. So I think it's recognising that inherent uncertainty and looking to find the most appropriate timely point for your scrutiny. Always recognising, I think, that we need to be responsive to what will be unique issues and challenges that will emerge, some of which I don't think we can predict at this point, but also on the bedrock of that, trying to then improve our financial information.
There's the old saying, isn't there, of fool me once, shame on you. I won't fall into the bush trap of trying to do the whole thing. But a lot of our scrutiny is done in the rearview mirror. And so it's making sure that we don't have those same challenges that we have. So, for example, something that's come up time and time again, which we'll get to later, is the sort of underestimation of what the final budget looks like. So part of our scrutiny here is to make sure we don't, we avoid the potholes perhaps we've driven through previously. Did I see Len wanted to come in? Thanks.
I know we're looking at total controls, but can we just have I take it the answer to the last question that we're drawing a line under the previous processes which can't have been good for you, and they certainly weren't good for us in terms of scrutinising what was going on. Yes, we know there are things that come in late, but there are issues of the process as we go through this budget making that just doesn't feel comfortable with me, and particularly with the difficulties of COVID and some of those issues. But I just want some reassurance. So in terms of the GLA group, whether it's David or the other David answers the question, right, are we assured that the GLA group, both MOPAC and TfL, are going to stick to the timelines that you've published in this guidance in terms of giving you the information that you can? Of course, there's a caveat for some of their work. We all understand that. But in terms of some of their late submissions to the process, made it difficult for us and must have made it difficult for you. Now, I don't expect you to start banging the table and beating people over the head in public about it, but it's just not good enough. We can do better. We're not some Mickey Mouse authority or group, but it does come across in some of our approaches, I think. It doesn't reflect well on us. It doesn't reflect well. So what are you doing, because you're rolled in the ring on the GLA group, to impress upon your colleagues that are helping you to hold the line on terms of the timelines that you've set out and you want to stick to? Now, the external things I know you can't help, so I'm not asking you to do that. It's the things that we control. I want to know that you've got a grip on it and you're going to hold people to account who are working to you, not to anybody else. They think they're working to others, they're working to you.
David might want to comment on specifics, but perhaps it's just helpful if I just then publicly say that for the avoidance of doubt, we absolutely expect all organisations in the group to fully abide by what's in the budget guidance. Now, we know that to be fair to TfL, that was not possible last year because of the funding negotiations with the government, and you have to have the certainty of that in order that they could produce a submission. But now, with a funding deal for TfL in place to the end of 23-24, that doesn't affect them. So what I'm expecting, and I'm being badgered for a meeting to talk about the TfL business planning process, which hopefully I can do soon now. Yeah, I'm absolutely expecting them to have their business planning process that ties in with the GLA group process, as we did in pre-COVID times.
And Len, just to add to what David has said, because we've done an awful lot of work, particularly with TfL, who have often been the people, the functional body that hasn't complied with the deadlines. An awful lot of work with them to try and synchronise, our own separate processes to ensure that, yes, TfL have to have their finance committee, they have to have their board processes to agree the business plan, but ensuring that if those don't quite synchronise, at least we have the information privately and can work at risk in consolidating that information. So we've done an awful lot of work, and I think TfL are much more appreciative now of the constraints that we have to work on and why it's so important that they do actually comply absolutely with the deadlines we set out in the guidance. I'm generally speaking, I don't think the other functional bodies have actually been a problem in terms of timelines. Certainly over most recent years, I don't think they have been. So I think it's been targeting TfL. And just to reiterate, I think what David and Enver both lead on, obviously there's a quarterly meeting that David's described with the functional bodies, but there's a monthly meeting that Enver has with functional bodies where this is top of the agenda and is clearly monitoring progress on ensuring that the budget submission is made on time. And obviously for this year, we're looking particularly closely for that to ensure that returns are not only with us by the 25th, but obviously are on their websites so that obviously your officers can then begin to scrutinise and develop your own scrutiny of those submissions.
Okay, so in the past also there has been an issue about transparency. Now I know that the Mayor made a commitment when he first came into office about transparency and budgeting issues. So the question that I have here, and I take it that it's not here, and I was very much taken by your answer to the last question about the challenges we face, and we're facing a budget like no other budget, or for the next couple of years, as David Bellamy rightly started to think about how do we do this. So in that doing that, so, and there's not a great deal in the budget guidance about transparency, about some of those issues in terms of the information you're going to present to this committee through this process. Are you thinking about what that looks like in terms of transferring and understanding of what you're doing within the budgets to enable us to ask questions? What internal conversation have you had around that in terms of making sure this process is right, given that our respective roles? You've got a job to do in producing a budget to drive, policies and processes for Londoners. We have a duty to scrutinise that in the best possible way. So what's your thinking about that? What steps, what's new in this process that in terms of the way that you're going to present, or some of your colleagues in the GLA group are going to present information to this committee?
So I think the big thing that we really need to focus in on to ensure there's a degree of transparency of the key issues goes back to inflation. Inflation is clearly going to be the dominant issue as to how budgets are balanced. Therefore, there's a lot of work that we are doing at the moment to isolate the detail of inflation, both pay and non-pay, across the group, and setting that out in as clear a fashion as we can. Now, obviously, what I'd like to do is work, obviously, with yourselves. Obviously, informally we work in terms of the discussions at the Bureau of Leaders meetings, but obviously happy with your officers to look at the extent to which you might want to focus in on a particular area. So happy to have those conversations offline, if that's appropriate, around the requirements that you might particularly have, given, I guess, particularly the inflation issue that emerges. The constraint we have is the budget document is already 100 pages. It's a very, it's already a summary of the budget submissions that the functional bodies have had. So, there's a trade-off in terms of new information we want to put in, as against then the need to respond to particularly new issues. I think we'll probably turn later on to the issue of climate budgeting, which obviously is a key priority for the Mayor. And again, there's a whole set of new work that we're looking to integrate into the budget to reflect the importance of that for the Mayor. So those are for me, I guess, the two big things that I'm anticipating we will have additionally, but welcome the opportunity to hear obviously the committee's views now, but I guess working with you all offline to ensure that when we produce the budget consultation document, hopefully before Christmas, then it actually can meet the challenge you set out there, Len.
Chair, just one final point. Look, budgets are about, and I welcome what you've just said, and I also welcome, I think, the budget depends on the practical actions of it in terms of the climate actions around the budget making. I think I welcome that, and it's quite a creative issue, but I want to see the practical details of that. But in terms of that, budgets are about choices. I need to understand the choices that you're making. So when we talk about pressures and inflation, you rightly said about that, I need to understand what's desirable responses to those pressures, what's essential, right? And what's choices have we got? So when we present that, and I also need to understand the areas of growth in some of these budgets that we don't normally see. So we wouldn't see, particularly in the GLA group, the ups and downs of where the emphasis would be. And I think that we should be able to do that in a very and clarify some of the direction of travel, and we should be able to do it rather than what we get back from the MPS, the broad sums. What do we get for the tax bucks? What is really going on for that 5% that the chair alluded earlier? I think we understand about TFLs, but we need to see it in much more clearer ways than probably we've seen it in the past, for the very reason that you described, that we are facing very difficult times, and this is going to be a very different budget process.
Chairman, if I could just respond to Len's important comments. I agree. I think what we have had in the past is perhaps not a wholly consistent level of detail being shown around particularly the committed growth and savings. So I think we again did some more work with TfL recently, the last few years, to ensure there was more detail about their growth and savings, and I think we could require that from more widely across the group to ensure there's a consistency in the level of detail being shown. Obviously, one of the problems we have is that obviously TfL and the Met are the big members of the group, and therefore the scale of their changes tends to dwarf those of the others. But I think even so, there's still a sense to pull up everybody up to perhaps that TfL standard, which I'm sure we can do. Going back to the issue of choices, one of the the dilemmas that you know of is that almost certainly we're not going to be in a place really until early February, when the final budget is prepared, for the Mayor's final choices on allocation of resources, whether it's to essential and desirable, is actually known at that particular point. So again, I think it comes back to how we make the best of that situation, and whether it's a sort of after the event scrutiny of the Mayor's proposals to then be agreed in February to take place, say, after that event with each functional body, might be an idea worth pursuing, as we've kind of talked informally about, because I think that's the way ultimately of perhaps getting a better level of conversation about the choices that have been made, rather than expecting you to do that with very little notice in February.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and that's that's the discussion, isn't it? Because we have this dance every year. And repeating it year in, year out doesn't seem to be a sensible way of doing things. So we need that transparency, we need that information up. And hand over to Assemblymember Hall, who I think has got some questions on this, and then you're going to lead into the second section, which is on funding sources and uncertainty.
Thank you, Chair. That's exactly what I'm going to do. First of all, can you help me? I didn't quite catch. You were talking about £10 million for TfL. Where did... it must be me, I must have missed it. Where is that money coming from? Is it from last year's?
No, it's I mean, Enver may be able to give a more technical answer, but at a high level, it's just, when the latest calculations were done on our expectations of, how much money the Mayor would have to allocate, there was, I think, £10.2 million more than we thought when we did the budget in February. And so that was just available to allocate.
So there was already 339 million extra than we thought, than between the February, the January and the February?
I can remember off the
think,
top of my head the changes during the budget process last year.
I think
It was
But we
extraordinary amount of money.
We also have
though.
to be careful about distinguishing between things that recur and things that are one-off as well.
Yeah, no, but 339 was the difference, I believe, between, yes, Enver, thank you, Enver is nodding at me, between January and February. An extraordinary amount of money, as I'm sure you'll agree. So you're now telling us that there's an extra 10 million that you just came upon.
Can I just answer this?
Yes, please do. Somebody give us a...
No, so you're absolutely right, Assembly Member. The 339 was part of the 22-23 budget setting process.
Yeah,
The 10.2 million that Mr. Bellamy is referring to is when we're looking at the allocations for 23-24.
right.
So, to be precise, when we set the 23-24 indicative budget, when we published the 22-23 budgets, remember we showed the future years as well. For 23-24, when we published the 22-23 budgets, we had a figure of 3648.4. The actual number in the budget guidance for 23-24 has moved up by 10.2 million. So it's only a 10 million difference from our assumptions in February to our assumptions in July. And that's mainly driven by the 0.5% difference in the inflation that we've applied to the business rates, because we were previously assuming 2% and we've increased it to 2.5%. And that 10.2 has been, I won't say hypothecated because it's not quite the right word, but that total increase has been applied to TfL for reasons that will be apparent in due course.
Okay. When is due course? Next week, month?
It's relatively soon. It would have been published had not...
No, fair enough. Okay. So very soon, obviously then. If
it's in the backlog of things to publish. So
yeah,
yes.
I can imagine that. Okay, so let's move on to group funding sources. David Gallie, what is driving the uncertainty over council tax and business rates income? How are the GLA and functional bodies adapting its processes to deliver their budgets for the coming year, given the level of uncertainty?
I mean, the most important uncertainty around business rates reflects the decision the government will have to make about the multiplier. So, as you recall, Member Hall, the government effectively do not require businesses to have increases related to RPI, but they compensate us and other local authorities by giving grant. Now, to date, they've honoured that RPI commitment, albeit it's not until February that we had that last year. And I think for me the biggest level of uncertainty with inflation at the current levels it is, I worry that the government are really going to be able to afford or be willing to give us grant of the levels that are currently anticipated as inflation. You know, is it realistic to think that they're going to give us the order of 9% increase on our business rates? I think that is unlikely. Obviously, it would be one that we perhaps, should expect. But I think, given other constraints on government, that's going to be particularly difficult. But the problem we have is that decision has historically been made very late in the day. Now, I've pressed directly with the senior civil servant in charge of this area to give us that information as soon as possible, because it becomes such a critical element. So not only, obviously the numbers we're talking about become very, very large, but a potential 9% increase on our business rate sum of the best part of 3 billion suddenly gets into very, very large variances. So I think that's the biggest thing on business rates. On council tax, we're obviously in the hands of the borough returns. And although in this year's budget we had a council tax base increase of 1.7%, the view that we've taken is that that increase was largely catching up for some of the lags that arose during COVID. So we've assumed only a 1% increase in council tax base. And obviously we look to review that based on information that's coming through from all the boroughs, all the informal contacts that we have around what's occurring in boroughs. But again, is ultimately going to have to wait for the borough returns on council tax base by the end of January. So those are, I think, the two things I'd highlight.
So council tax rates 1%, business rates it was 2.5.
The assumption we've made is 2.5%. That's obviously significantly below the level of the current level of RPI, which has been historically where the government has increased the multiplier. So the range of that increase could be, significant if the government were to honour that commitment. I think the context, though, that we need to consider is that, clearly no one knows exactly what inflation is going to be come the new financial year, but it wouldn't be unreasonable for the government to take a view that they would take a midpoint estimate of inflation this time next year. What do they think inflation is going to be in September 23? And I think everyone would hope that inflation is going to be significantly lower, perhaps of the order more of 5% rather than the 9-10% that we have currently. So I think it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that the government are not going to honour the current levels of inflation. What they should be doing, what they're committed to in the regulations, is to effectively pass the multiplier based on the RPI in September, rather than making a different estimate of what they might think inflation will actually hit authorities during financial year 23-24. The other thing that I think I'm mindful of why 2.5% as against a higher percentage is we understand that government are instructing their own departments to budget on their own basis of a GDP deflator of 4%. Now, overall, the increase in the resources, once you allow for the TfL bandy £20 increase in precept, overall our overall level resources are going up, excluding one-off items from this year's budget, is 4.4%. And if you look at the more optimistic scenario that we've painted as well, we have painted a range between 2.5% as the central scenario up to 6%, i.e. sort of a midpoint between that 4%. So that's the kind of the range of options that we have set out, which hopefully will encompass what actually we'll have come the new year.
So how often do you review these assumptions? If there's anything that's significant that changes between publishing the budget guidance and now, so...
Yeah, we'll look, we will obviously listen very carefully to the statement that be made on Friday from the Chancellor, in particular around energy bills, support for the public sector, and whether the extent to which we may be eligible for that level of support. There may be, I'm sure, other things in that statement that will be important, but I think we need to await some form of spending settlement. I don't think it won't be a comprehensive spending review, but we assume there will be some form of proper spending settlement announced, hopefully not too late in October or early November, which would then allow government departments to then set out the settlements for ourselves and for transport and for police as well. But obviously we will look to monitor very closely any statements that are made by government. Clearly the sector as a whole, through our local government association, other bodies, other professional bodies, are pushing very hard, because the endemic uncertainty that we've described, is across the whole of local government. This is not an issue that's unique to the GLA. All of us in local government need to have some further guidance from the government as soon as possible, so we can actually look to try and address these spending pressures that we all know are there.
Okay, so if things come out on Friday that will change your predictions, if you like, are you going to look at these figures again and come back to us before the end of January?
Yeah, I'm happy to, whether it's more through informal channels rather than through the formal committee structure, but happy obviously to give updates from any relevant changes that emerge from, say, Friday's announcement. I think one of the important things there would be, obviously we're gathering data across the group, as I described earlier, on energy costs in particular. And so, if there is some announcement that's relevant to the members of the group on energy, then clearly that will reflect the pressures that we'll need to accommodate in the budget submissions, and it's clearly relevant for how we accommodate the overall gap that we're anticipating will be there between inflation and the level of funding we're anticipating. I'm happy to do that, either formally or informally. Similarly, when we have the some form of settlement from the government, say in late October, early November, but date unknown at this particular point, again, happy to set that out. That may give us some clues about the extent to which the local government department has been successful in its bidding processes. It will be interesting to see what the Home Office may have on policing. Happy to set out what we can glean from those statements, but it's probably not until a provisional settlement, which I again emphasise could be very late in the process, could be virtually before Christmas, it could be in the new year. It's only at that point that we'll have, I think, real numbers, initial numbers for GLA, for police, for fire and for transport.
Yeah, you see, some of us are concerned with these assumptions. They're pessimistic assumptions, to say the least. And I haven't heard any actual evidence. I've heard your thinking around it, but not any actual evidence as to why they are at 1% and 2.5%. I don't particularly accept some of what you're saying, and I think with good reason, given the history. So why...
Well, if I can just respond to that, I think I've explained why we've assumed 1% council tax compared with the 1.7% we've had in 22-23, which reflects the changes. And on business rates, I would love nothing better than if the government gave me some information that we could sensibly plan beyond what I would consider to be prudent assumptions on business rates. I wish the government were able to give us more detail that allows us to plan in a more sensible long-term fashion.
And I wish that the planning for the budgets was far more accurate than it has been over the last 6 years. The Mayor has had 6 budgets, and in total they have seen nearly £1.2 billion of additional funding in terms of council tax and business rates added between January and February budgets. Then that money is applied to whatever the Mayor wants to without any proper scrutiny from us. And this is why you get the attitude from us that you get, because we hear this every year. You're cautious about this, you're cautious about that, and hey presto, between the budgets that we scrutinise for hours and hours and hours, and then the final budget, suddenly the final budget, the Mayor's got a massive windfall that he puts into something that none of us have had sight of until that time. That is why we are reluctant to take on board some of the comments you're making, Mr. Gallie. What do you think about that, Mr. Gallie?
I just want to respond to a couple of points there first.
You're Mr. Bellamy.
I know. Firstly, we have David has a statutory duty to be prudent. It's not a matter of choice. It's a statutory duty to do so, and he's got to carry that out. Secondly, it's not his fault. It's not the Mayor's fault. It's not the committee's fault. It is the position and the process the government follows in terms of when billing authorities have to give their returns, and of course if they made their returns earlier they would be less accurate, which would increase financial risk, so we must be mindful of that. And secondly, in terms of when the government takes its decisions. Now, the government usually uses September inflation in terms of business rates. So it is open to the government in October, when that figure comes out, to say, to businesses, well, this is what the increase will be in your business rate bill, so you businesses have got certainty and you can prepare for that. And they could at the same time say, and look into the local regional government sector, this is, yes, you will get all this money, or we've held down the increase for businesses and so we will top it up. They absolutely could tell us that in October. They tell us in February. That's what gives us 1 week to apply all this stuff. It's a horrible process for us. It's a horrible process for you. But it's a result of the approach the government's taken that, despite lobbying, they don't want to move away from.
Well, I would disagree. I would say it isn't. This isn't a question of prudence. This is a question of responsibility, and to be clear to functional bodies about the level of funding they'll receive. And every year, this mayor's guidance has been wrong. Every single year. It's not that you're sometimes under. You're always under, and by an average of over 200 million a year. So do you actually think that's helpful to the functional bodies when they're planning their budgets? Do you think it's actually fair?
What I'd say is that the assumption we've made of the uplift that I explained earlier, which is overall 4.4% for next year, is a prudent and reasonable assumption about the overall increase we have, given the absence of any real guidance from the government about the level of particularly business rate support that they'll be giving to local authorities.
Mr. Gallie, you've got it wrong or it has been got wrong for the last 6 years. You cannot expect us to have a great deal of faith. Will you and the GLA's finance officers make a commitment to consider this point, please, although we've made it for enough years and nobody seems to be listening? You continue, and the sum last year was extraordinary. When looking at the guidance next year, will you at least do that for next year? Because if not, you will be sitting here opposite me again saying it for the 7th year.
Well, I also hope that I'll be able to explain to you again the uncertainty and the timing that we have on government decisions, which means it's effectively impossible for us to set out the level of resources that is available to the mayor until early February. And that is the nature of the system. Now, the last thing that I want to do, as I've repeated over perhaps more years than we both care to remember, is that the last thing that I want to do is to set up a level of funding to the GLA group, which then has to be reversed because the assumptions have proven to be too optimistic. And the other thing to say is that the government has, it is their regime, they have an absolute ability through the system of tariffs and levies and top-ups to be able to change at whim the GLA's receipt of business rates, and even a very small percentage change in our business rates leads to large multi-million changes. A 1% change in the GLA's business rates leads to a 30 million change.
I know that because you have said it for years, and for years you've got it very wrong. The assumptions are incorrect because you've been too, and you like to call it prudent. Every year I sit there and wonder what the mayor is going to do with the next windfall, which seems to come within that month. So would you agree that this approach is likely to result in large additional amounts being added to the plans at the start of February next year, as they were this year, as they were the year before, and the year before that?
Well, I would look to err on the side of prudence, which I think I've done. We'll need to await hopefully the process. The government will give us more information before that date, but it will only be at that particular date that I can then confirm the level of resources that will be available to the mayor.
This cautious financial approach has just seen really so much money left at the end of the year that could have been planned for better with the various different bodies. And at this point, then, can I ask you, how advanced was a green bond scheme, for example, when it suddenly popped up in February budget? How much of the work was done on this between January and February, and how much of that work had been done in gestation during that time? Because suddenly, I think it was £90 million went into green bonds. We knew nothing about it, and suddenly, there it was.
So we're making good progress with the issuance
No,
of the green bond.
how much work had been done on that beforehand?
We looked at this as a key issue around how the mayor's net zero commitment for 2030 could be realised, and so that was clearly an area that we'd spent some time working through, but it was only at the point at which the resources identified in early February were crystallised, and that was then subject to the Mayor's Office decision-making process, that then was agreed.
So how long had the work gone on in terms of months or years for the green bonds?
I haven't got the detail behind
Can
that,
you make
but-
sure this committee gets those details, please?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
In writing. That would be helpful.
I would be happy to reply to you.
Thank you. And can I also ask you what's being worked on this year for this year's amount of money that the Mayor is going to miraculously suddenly have? What can we see appear in front of us in February this year to the tune of 90 million or whatever else that is left over from these very prudent assumptions?
Well, I think as we discussed earlier, the real issue is how do we manage the gap that I think will be there between the inflationary pressures, both pay and non-pay, compared with the funding level that we are likely to get.
Yes, I've heard this before.
And that becomes, I think, the dominant issue for how the group will bring forward its budget proposals rather than looking at additional growth. However, obviously we look forward to what we finally have the level of resource available in early February. And at that point, the Mayor will obviously need to make final decisions. I suspect some of those decisions will be about what is able to be funded to cope with those inflationary pressures rather than a series of new growth bids.
So you can confirm he's not working on any new growth bids like the green bonds this year?
I'm sure the Mayor's office have all sorts of ambitions that they're working on, and doubtless that will become part of the wider budget deliberations across the group.
So you'd call the green bonds was an ambition that suddenly ended with £90 million. Is that correct?
I mean, there's 90 million been allocated to the green bond, and that's clearly part of the Mayor's ambitions for his net zero commitment for 2030.
It's a shame we had no sight of that beforehand. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. I just want to follow up on that point, and for context, and I understand, David Gallie, what you were saying about the processes, but for context, 17-18 was an additional 27 million, 18-19 was an additional 267 million, 19-20 was an additional 229 million, 2021 was an additional 143 million, 21-22 was an additional 183 million, and 22-23 was an additional 339 million. So these are big numbers, and I get what you're saying about the percentage variables. Is there a way, and I understand the amount of work that goes on, but is there, and I think this is what Assembly Member Hall was alluding to, is there a wish list? Is there a sort of future project that would like to be funded, but because of prudential budgeting can't be funded? However, if there was an extra 100 million, 150 million, 200 million, 300 million, 340 million, these projects would start to come into scope. So we could sort of forward project what could happen should those rates change.
I think because it's probably a question for me, Chair, I think what I would say is there are two things. Firstly, there is absolutely, there's no doubt, as David has said, that this year's budget process is going to be very challenging. And, probably the first call on additional money will be saying, OK, right, there's some things in the budget, some decisions that are tough but necessary in order to balance budgets that, ideally we wouldn't take. And that would probably be the first consideration for that, given that we're in a higher inflation environment than we have been in the previous period. Beyond that, what I think I would direct you to is the answer the Mayor gave this committee in January when he was asked this question, and he set out the five priority areas that he was focused on, and I think that remains the case. And obviously, through the development of this budget process, we'll be able to review where we are in those areas, and indeed any other things that become priorities given the wider situation in London, and we'll be able to give some steer on that as the process moves forward.
So I get that, and as I said to David earlier, there is a case of doing this dance every year, which becomes, suboptimal in terms of time usage. But you've got those five priority areas, and what it sounds like you're saying is that the Mayor's got things on the boil in those priority areas that, should funding become available, those projects might start to come to fruition. So, for example, something that we found with the when we were talking to TfL was the fact that there was investment going in to develop road user charging technology, which is projecting a project coming on stream in a couple of years. So preparations are taking place for that. And, reflecting back to what Len was saying as well, where we're just seeing top-line data here in some of this reporting, there's no way we could get into those individual work streams to see that was happening. So if there are projects on the boil, projects that are being prepared for that might come into scope should money become available, is there a way of sort of giving us an idea of what they are in those different priority areas?
I mean, I think it's something that we need to find a way of you discussing when you meet with each organisation, the things they're working on. I mean, obviously, the specific TfL instance, clearly the road user charging systems exist at the moment in operation, and they're in a situation where the end of the contract's up and replacement was needed, and they've taken their recommendation was that one of the key aspects of those systems should be developed in-house so that we have the flexibility and the control, and we retain the intellectual property. And so they're proceeding in that way. And so it's how those things get built into budgets, and how there are additional things beyond that are beyond the budget that they and the Mayor would like to see happen.
So that's the point, because it's the specific policy decisions like a green bond, or with the road user charging, it's the paper mile road user charging, the technology that's needed to use their camera network and process any fines that come with it, or bills that come with it. So these are projects that are being developed that, should funding become available, might be accelerated. And it would just be useful to maybe have sight of some of those, so that nothing pops up on the radar for the first time. But anyway, look, we shall move on from there, unless anybody else had anything that they wanted to talk about with group funding and uncertainty. Okay, we'll move on from uncertainty to inflation. So let's go for Caroline Pigeon. Thank you.
There we go. Beautiful opener to that. If I start with David Bellamy, your budget guidance highlights three key sort of factors as a backdrop: the soaring inflation, economic impact of the pandemic, and the fallout from Brexit. So could you outline for us what has been the financial impact of each of these on the budget and how you've arrived at the numbers?
Well, I think, Assembly Member, I'd say that the numbers set out in the budget guidance, as we say, are just a roll forward with that one change we've touched on to what was in the budget in February, and it really reflects the uncertainty. So there is big uncertainty. We've just covered it on the income side, and the decisions the government will take there to perhaps a slightly lesser extent, but might become material were there to be a big recession, for example. What local authorities might forecast in terms of their billing authority returns for business rates, in particular, also lesser degree council tax. So it creates big uncertainty there, and also big uncertainty in terms of inflation and what's going to happen on interest rates. And clearly, since we prepared the budget guidance in July, we were halfway through it when the then Prime Minister announced he was resigning, and we now have a new Prime Minister, and we're now starting to understand, delayed for obvious reasons, the policies that the government's going to introduce. And so that raises real questions for me about the kind of direct impact on our expenditure in terms of the announcement today. What is the scope of that in terms of how it impacts our energy costs? The government have said that it's only for 6 months, so it's only for this financial year, and there are some restrictions associated with it, but they'll review after 3 months about whether they're going to do anything in the longer term. We're obviously already sat here trying to write our budgets for next financial year, but on the basis of what the government said today, they're not going to look at it until Christmas. And so by then we need to have a consultation budget out, and we're not going to know what the government's position is going to be from what they've said today on energy costs until after that. So that uncertainty is going to persist. And I think there's probably a lot of things that will work through the economic system in terms of the impacts of inflation, government tax and spend decisions, which obviously we'll see what the Chancellor says on Friday, what impact that will have on the exchange rate, what in terms of the impact of borrowing, and then what the exchange rate will do to inflation of imported goods. And so there seem to be huge uncertainties about all these things, and it's really just going to be a case, I think, of monitoring closely, and at each stage of the process when we're looking to, produce a submission, just trying to work on the best we can on the latest information we have. But it's going to be a very dynamic situation.
So you're going to have to revise it clearly throughout the process. Maybe David Gallie, what's your assumption for inflation in the budget guidance you've put out? Do you want to put that on record?
I mean, as I said earlier, overall the increase across the group is 4.4%, albeit that's been generated to a large extent by the TfL bandy £20 extra. And hence the extra to TfL. But obviously, as you indicate, Caroline, we need to monitor this really, really closely. Obviously, we're in the middle of functional bodies, GLA, preparing their own budgets, working through the detail of all this. So this is something that is a very dynamic process. It's obviously subject to a whole series of interventions and changes that will occur. The snapshot now could be very different in a snapshot in 3-6 months' time.
Thank you. If I just drill down into one area, salaries across the GLA group, what is your expectation around increase in salaries compared with the last year?
Obviously salaries are separate individual decisions being made by different people depending on their the way in which the salaries are negotiated. So police and TfL and fire obviously have their own separate processes. So it's largely from a GLA perspective, the MDCs following GLA and MOPAC following GLA to a lesser extent. Now, our GLA mayor budget assumption on pay going forward at the moment is 2%, as in that's the overall average pay award that was granted to staff in this financial year, albeit 3.2% to grade 12s, 2% to the rest of staff above that grade. Now, it's fairly evident, given industrial action, industrial threats of offers being made of 5% in, say, Scotland or even indeed certain London boroughs, that 2% is clearly one that's going to come under a huge amount of pressure. But clearly there are decisions that we need to make around what is affordable for a pay award compared with what funding we currently have available. So it's one of the most sort of glaring gaps, as I said earlier, between the funding that we can assume compared with the likely inflationary pressure that we have.
But your assumption is 2% for the GLA group, and that presumably would include LLDC and OPDC?
So I think it's, we've got assumptions about control totals at this stage. We don't have assumptions. I don't think we've said anything in the budget guidance about what we assume about pay. That's clearly one of the fundamental things each organisation needs to think about as it puts that together. Now, if you're writing the Met Police budget, then you're really trying to form a view of what decision the government is going to take about police officer pay, because it's their decision. If you're writing the LFB budget, then you're really thinking about, well, where are the national negotiations likely to go? Because obviously that's the nationally agreed, and then London has to pay that for its staff. Whereas, as David said, if we were thinking about GLA and development corporations, that's much more locally decided, and there probably will be a bit of a look for consistency, because it would, OPDC are tied into the same pay and grading structure as the GLA anyway, and LLDC always try and be broadly consistent. So we'll have those discussions, but what we don't understand, really, I think we've got quite low confidence in saying what levels of inflation will be in the next financial year, because what we don't know yet is the detail of the government's announcements on energy, what else they've got to say in the economy more generally, what impacts that will have on inflation, and probably there are some things that they're doing that will push down on inflation. There are other things that could lead to it rising over time. So it's very hard to know, and it's going to be a case of, well, what are the appropriate assumptions to make as each organisation builds their budget, and then firstly the mayor secondly, yourselves through your scrutiny process saying, well, right, why have you made those assumptions? Are they sensible? Do we feel that they're equitable compared to what's happening in other parts of the group?
Okay, and then what about TfL? Because that's one big group you've missed off, and clearly there were some words in the financial agreement, the letter that came out on the 30th of August from government, and in there it's very clear about London Underground salaries in particular. What assumptions do you think they will be making as part of this budget process for salaries?
I mean, you're right to say that this year is the final year of the multi-year London Underground pay deal, and so there will need to be negotiation there, and yes, something will need to be assumed in the budget. I haven't yet had that discussion with TfL in terms of where their thinking's at the moment, but clearly TfL differs from the Met Police. The Met Police, from memory, is about 75% staffing costs, its budget, whereas TfL, the staffing cost is actually a minority of its budget. So it's actually probably a more critical decision for the Met than it is for TfL. But clearly there's going to be a lot of discussion about that as TfL puts together its budget submission over the next 2 months.
Yeah, but will you be picking up with TfL? Because there was a specific clause, I haven't got the letter with me, where they stated that obviously whatever one thinks, the government thinks the London Underground settlement was far too high, and they have asked for the sort of difference, the additional percentages that London Underground are getting this year to be funded out of TfL's bit of funding rather than the government's. Not quite sure how you separate them out. It's always, but they specified that, so that could put an additional pressure on your overall TfL budget and staffing budget.
Yeah, I mean, there's no getting away from, like, inflation generally is a very big concern across the group, whether it's staffing or non-staffing, and we will have to look at the best ways of handling that. And the reason why fundamentally why the outcome of the TfL pay, the LU should say, not TfL, the LU pay award looks high is because inflation was high. If inflation had been lower as it was, then the numbers would have been much smaller.
Okay, lovely. I'm sure we'll be coming back to this at future meetings. Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Horani, did you want to come in at this point?
Yeah, just very, very quickly to David.
Sorry, Assembly Member, can you speak up or do something with the volume, or can somebody technical do something? I can't quite make you out, I'm afraid.
Okay, I'll try by moving closer. I don't know if that helps. Yeah, great. Just to David Bellamy. So do you anticipate that if there are any areas of delivery that may have to be scaled back in the 23-24 budget, specifically looking at sort of the inflation, Brexit and pandemic pressures?
I mean, it's certainly possible. The GLA mayor's budget's approach to inflation has traditionally been you have to accommodate it within individual projects and programmes, and so that absolutely could impact on delivery. And what we'll have to be doing as we go through the budget process is saying, okay, are there any projects where that approach isn't appropriate and we do need to put in increased funds behind it? But then, of course, that has to come at the expense of somewhere else because the budget has to balance. So, there absolutely is the risk of that, and it will play out differently in different organisations because each one's circumstances are unique. But we are undoubtedly going to have to look at that and have to accept that some things, I think you see it particularly in physical delivery related projects, are just a lot more expensive now.
And could I perhaps just add to what David has said, because it's a really important issue you've raised. Certainly for the GLA Mayor Capital Programme, because it's largely cash limited by government grant, the impact is we're not anticipating we'll get more housing grant that will come through from government, and inevitably it'll be an assessment of the extent to which there is an impact upon delivery of living within that cash limited amount, rather than necessarily anticipating additional resources. So I think a key bit of work in assessing the overall impact of the budget will be the impact of living within a constrained resource that isn't going to increase.
Thanks. So I think because you mentioned housing and housing delivery, I will just delve into that in particular. just on the basis of, I think, some of the casework that I've been receiving as well from people anxious on delivery dates in terms of decisions from either the GLA group or local authorities as well. Every week delay is having an impact on costs of construction. So naturally, I think people are getting a bit anxious whenever there's a delay in announcement of an outcome of a planning application, for example. What sort of impact is this having on housing delivery as well?
Well, I don't have specific numbers in front of me, and we'll report on starts and so forth in the usual way because it's a regulated national statistic. But yeah, what I can do is reassure you, the Assembly Member, that because you're right in terms of plan anything, whether it's planning or otherwise, that delays schemes means they will be more expensive. So there's a real urgency to getting even more than was the case already, to getting things underway. And we do run a process where Housing and Land obviously work very closely with local authorities and development partners, and where there are things where it looks like there might be delays in the planning system, those get raised up, and we do speak to our colleagues in the boroughs and see what can be done about it, because we're committed to getting these schemes underway as quickly as we can.
Right, and a final one from me, just on the pandemic and the continuing costs of the pandemic. So what are the main continuing costs of the pandemic, and what impact has that had on the budget guidance?
Well, I think on the whole, income levels have recovered relatively well in terms of tax income. Clearly, the big thing is that where we are in terms of passenger fares, and that just means while we've got the government support in terms of some a guard against fares dipping, for instance, if there was a new variant of COVID or something like that, which provides us with a lot of reassurance. Those fares are at the lower level. We actually on Sunday had, I think, the first time since the pandemic, TfL passenger numbers got 1% above their typical pre-pandemic level, and clearly that was for truly exceptional circumstances that none of us want to see repeated. So that is undoubtedly the big issue. And then beyond that, it's really, I guess, a view about untangling the impact of saying, well, all the inflation and cost pressures we're seeing, how much of that is about knock-ons in the economy. For instance, supply chain issues going back to China and how COVID's impacting there. How much of it, some of the energy stuff is related to COVID. Clearly a lot is related to the war in Ukraine, and various other factors like Brexit. And so it's very hard to disentangle and actually say, well, this is still the effect of COVID. The one area where it's really clear, I think, is TfL passenger numbers.
Thanks. That's it from me, Chair.
Thank you very much. We've strayed a little bit away from inflation, but I know bringing us back on target is going to be Assembly Member Rogers.
Thank you, Chair. I hope I don't disappoint. David Bellamy, what's your expectation for the increase in TfL fares in 22-23 and 23-24?
I'll be honest, I don't have one yet. That will come. The Mayor will consider that through the process. Obviously we got the funding deal agreed with the government at the end of August, and we now TfL firstly need to produce an updated budget for this year, and which will go to their board at its next meeting, which I think is early next month, and then into the business planning, which will give a multi-year view, and it's through understanding that, and plus any other economic developments as we've been talking about, that will give the Mayor the information he needs to consider policy around fares.
So you mentioned the Mayor will consider this, and clearly he has, because he's spoken to the media about a possible 14% increase in fares, whereas the settlement letter refers to a 4% assumption. So which do you think of these two is more likely, and which are you working to?
So, yeah, I think what the Mayor was doing was saying, well, yeah, the RPI +1, which has been the TfL planning assumption, and was what the government was insisting on in the early point, the early fare settlements, would now produce that really eye-watering figure because RPI is so high. And so, clearly, the Mayor wouldn't want to see fares going up by that much, but we can't really get into any decisions about that until we've got more information.
What conversations have you had with the Mayor about it, though? Do you know where he's thinking? Is he still looking at that 14% figure?
So, we're not having conversations about it actively at the moment because we need to wait for the TfL budget, because, of course, the Mayor would never want to put fares up, but equally we've got to provide the public transport system that London needs. And so, that's a judgment the Mayor can only reach when we have that information from TfL.
Thank you. To David Gallie, you mentioned earlier looking to, I think the phrase used was isolate the details of inflation. Obviously, it's currently it's high and variable. So how do you plan to incorporate the impacts of inflation into the budgeting setting process for 23-24? I know you've touched on this earlier.
Yeah, and obviously we need to disentangle pay from non-pay, and within the non-pay there's clearly a whole set of issues that arise. Energy, for instance, obviously there may, as we mentioned earlier, be something that's relevant from the statement on Friday, which helps reduce down the inflationary pressures there, which are probably the most pronounced, as against, say, the comment I made earlier around the capital programme, where I think we have to look to live within the cash limited sums that are available. So I think it very much the non-pay item is driven by the particular circumstances, and there's a lot of work that we're doing with actually each of the functional bodies, because obviously all their contracts are different. Some are linked to RPI, some are not linked to RPI. There's obviously conversations going on with contractors where there's clearly pressure to extract an increase in budget as against then the impact of delivery that would then emerge. So there's a whole set of detailed conversations, and obviously we want to consolidate not just the revenue budget but clearly the capital programme as well, around reflecting the impact of those inflationary pressures. So it'll be a natural part of how we present the budget. But then going back to the comment that Len has made, again, one of the things that we have previously set out is I'm sure you recall in the budget consultation document we set out an overall level of inflationary increase for each functional body. I think disentangling that, particularly at least for non-pay pay, would be important. So again, I think some issues they're happy to kind of talk offline around how we might ensure transparency around the detail of inflation. But I think given its importance, it's clearly something that we need to set out in more detail than we have done in previous years' budgets.
Thank you. And you mentioned energy, obviously particular relevance to TfL. So what's the anticipated impact on TfL of the increase in energy prices?
I mean, TfL are have been very fortunate or well planned, so that effectively they have actually been able to hedge their inflation costs on energy for this financial year. I think it's about 90%, I think, from memory. And even for next financial year, there's still a 70% hedge. So although TfL have obviously huge energy costs, there is a degree of protection from that. But again, as part of the detailed work we're doing with them, that's clearly a major item that needs to be accommodated within their budget.
And of course, TfL is going to be out significantly ahead in terms of energy uses. But which other functional bodies is this going to be a particular problem for?
Well, I mean, it's for the big firm. I mean, the Met is obviously a similar one, but also there's particular issues that arise for the Met, say, around their vehicle fleet, which is very large. Again, there's a very large inflationary increase from the petrol price that they have to pay for their vehicles.
There's also some of them very disproportionate impact for LLDC than you would think because of the stadium, which obviously has very high energy usage.
Absolutely, I imagine that's an incredibly expensive asset there. But that's all for me. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. If there's nothing from anyone else on this topic. We're going to move to the London climate budget, and Assembly Member Russell is going to start us off. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. And yes, I was very pleased to see that London is a C40 city climate budget pilot city. And so I've got a few questions really into how that may work. So my first question is for Enver, and in the sort of budget document, it talks about how the London climate budget will be transparent and will clearly visualise for Londoners, the London Assembly and other stakeholders how the GLA group is prioritising efforts to achieve its emissions target and any challenges faced. So I wonder, how will the GLA group deliver and report against the climate budget? What are we actually going to see?
What you'll see is behind what went out in the budget guidance, there was a more detailed one internally, because there was no point publishing detailed working papers for the public. Internally, we have a group, and it's been circulated to that group, and there are templates, and those templates will come back with their budget submissions. In those templates, there will be two tables. One table will set out what's already funded, what measures are within the existing budget that they submit, and their costs for those, and I'll come back onto costs later. In the second table, it will be what measures each functional body has identified that they believe they still need to put into place that aren't funded, and what their cost estimations are for those. So that's the aspiration. What we're working with them is how they calculate those costs and the consistency, so it's all presented in a consistent way. That's the ask.
Is it possible for this committee to see that those internal documents? I think
I'll forward those to you.
That would be really, really helpful. Thank you. So I also see that the that we're going to see the hang on, sorry, let me just get the right page here. We're going to be you've got different things happening in each year. So the 23-24 year, which is called Level 1, you're going to be looking at just GLA group reporting. Then Level 2, which is the next year, it'll include a set of actions to include actions sort of across the whole of London. But those are all Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And then the next year, Level 3, which is 25-26, you get really ambitious, and you're looking at Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. So that's the emissions that occur outside of London but are driven by our activity in London. So my next question is actually for David Bellamy, which is, how will given that setup, how will the climate budget be used to influence GLA policy?
Well, I mean, I think there's two sides to it. Firstly, there's the GLA group, and if we want to achieve net zero, then firstly we need to look at that within the group. And so that obviously is work that is being done, and it's why the private finance work, whether that's through the Green Bond or through subsequent things that will follow, is going to be so important, as well as maximising funding from government where that's available. So that's the first bit. The second bit, of course, the rest of London, if you like, where the mayor has no control. The best he can do is to try and set out the situation, and to be clear, even with the GLA group, this budget is not expected to go and say, there's a plan and we're at net zero 2030. The whole point of doing this is to say, well, there's more to do, and so to focus people on doing that. And so when we look at the pan-London perspective, it then is a tool for the mayor to be engaging with local authorities, with the private sector, the voluntary sector, other parts of the public sector, such as the health service, and say, look, this is what as mayor I'm saying we need to do, and how can you do more, because this shows that you're not doing your bit. And so it's, it's a tool for that convening and persuading power, and also it's transparency for Londoners in order that they can see what the picture is, and they will obviously, many of them will want to be putting pressure on the organisations that they personally interact with or work for to encourage them to work towards their bit of hitting net zero 2030.
So I think this is why I sort of raised these 3 different years, and because I'm just wondering if this is a very, very ambitious plan to, within 3 years, to be looking at scope 3 emissions. I mean, it's fantastic if we're doing that, because we absolutely have to do that if we're going to meet 2030 targets. But I'm just wondering, just whether you've got sort of very, what changes to the ways that policy is implemented are going to need to happen in order to meet this kind of timetable in a meaningful way.
Enver might want to comment. I think it's fair to say we've set out. Well, this is how we see it going. We know it's ambitious. And we're going to try and get there, but I think Enver's said that he's not going to stake his house on as absolutely getting there, because it is very ambitious, as you say, to try and do all of this in 3 years. But it's an emergency, and we will try the best we can. And then the point, I guess, is that by setting out the data, that leads people to think, okay, well, what are the policy changes? And so for instance, if you think about the Met, it's a really important consideration for their estate strategy, because they use a lot of vehicles for obvious reasons. And if you're in an environment where they, basically the previous shift comes back into the station, parks the car, clocks off, the new shift clocks on, goes out in the car. Well, you end up with a lot of cars coming back at the same time, which implies at that point you need a lot of rapid charging capabilities. And that obviously has its challenges. And so that is the sort of stuff that is one example of what has to be thought through, and then it has to feed through into the estate strategy. And we have to think about, well, what are the practical ways in which we can ensure that will be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Enver, did you want to add anything?
I mean, it is aspirational, but if we, 2030 isn't going to be pushed further back, is it? So we've got to have a glide path that gets us to there, and I think we have to do it in 25, 26 to at least show that ambition. Until we get the returns within the group, it's hard to say how ambitious this is, but we're not waiting for one to happen before we move to the next. We're already, with the environment teams across the GLA group, already beginning next year's, and by talking to the other cities and the C40 pilots, we're discussing scope 3 with them and what they're doing. So I'm hoping that at least putting this into train will not be something that we will wait to get to 25, 26 and then attempt it. Mm-hmm. So I'm on a call at least once a month with my equivalents across the boroughs, for example, and I would say more than 20 of them already got climate action plans in place. Mm-hmm. So I'm assuming that what we'll do at some point between now and this time next year is to have already started moving to that second level, and while we're doing that, start looking at level 3. But yep. I am, as David said, I'm not going to put my house on it, because a lot depends on what information exists out there.
Yeah, well, it's good you acknowledge it's a challenge, and it's great that you're trying to step up to that challenge. So my next question is about the kind of governance that's required for this, and what support has been offered to the chief financial officers of the functional bodies for this first year prior to the introduction of this climate budgeting. And I wonder, is that maybe the document that you just talked about that got circulated?
So I, together with an environment colleague, went to Oslo to meet with the other 12 cities. So we took that model of a senior finance person and a senior environment person from each city to do the representation and to take it back. We then applied that concept internally within the group, and there's a representative from each one of the functional bodies, who then are advocates to go back into their group. So when we put this budget guidance together and those templates, we designed it with them, and the environment team are actively involved. Now, it doesn't stop by issuing it, so a lot of the environment teams are already very progressed in their thinking. It's the finance people that need to do the catching up, and some of the other non-environmental people. You know, some estates people are really in that space, some of them are not. So what we've done is using the money that was already made available for the green bonds, because you have to have specialists who do that. There's no real difference between the specialists who do that and the people that we need on climate budgeting. So we've integrated that into the job specs for those people, and they will also be working on the climate budget. So we'll create a central pool of people that will be working on the green bonds, but also on climate budgeting. So there's that crossover. The oversight committee has seen this additional structure for additional environment people and additional finance people. That recruitment is well underway, and we've actually made some appointments. We've got to wait for those people to start. But in the meantime, because our budget process doesn't have any scope or any wiggle room, we've contracted with a company called WSP, who's, I don't know if she's the managing director or senior director, but the person who heads that company used to be the head of climate agency for England and Wales. So that team is already in place, giving support to the CFOs in those organisations if they ask the question. What we're not doing is doing it for them. So I think some people thought we were going to just do their climate budgets. That would be a bit disingenuous. So what we're saying to them is, we will guide you so there's consistency, but you've got to come to us with the questions. So that's the support we've got in place. So lots of stakeholder engagement. Every week I'm still talking to wider sets of stakeholders, and then alerting them to the support that's available centrally.
Thank you. So my final question is to David Gallie, which is, what is the anticipated cost, but also what's the anticipated benefit to the GLA and its functional bodies of moving to climate budgeting? Do you think that you will be seeing cost savings? I mean, for instance, just around more efficient use of energy in buildings and things like that, with energy costs so high now, if you're thinking about climate in your budgeting, is that actually also going to lead to some significant savings or reductions in spend in any areas?
Yes, I mean, it goes back to my earlier comment about the collaboration board programme. One of the key programmes there is work that we're doing on energy procurement, and essentially piggybacking on TfL's procurement process across the group to ensure not only do we drive out savings, but also the purchase of energy is green. So in this case, it's a kind of win-win here, where we're doing things to pursue the Mayor's net zero 2030 agenda, and also saving money. I mean, there obviously are, as Enver's described, as a small team that's been created here from the money that was allocated by the Mayor in the budget in February. So there is a cost of that team. I haven't got the details in front of me, we can obviously supply that to you. But I think broadly it's 4 officers, I think, in the finance team overall, and I think it's probably the same level in environment, who are ultimately going to be created to actually ensure that we can try and meet that ambition.
Do you know what proportion of TfL's energy procurement is green procurement?
I don't offhand. I'm sure it's something we can write back to you on.
I'd be very interested. It used to be, not that long ago, 0.01%. So if you've managed to increase it significantly since then, I'd be very glad to hear.
I think what this process will do will actually magnify this, and it might be a bit painful for us all to see what comes out. Nor do I think for a second that we're going to afford everything that we need to for net zero. So I think we've got to manage expectations that doing this doesn't mean we're going to find billions of pounds to do it, but it will highlight where we're not probably focusing our attention in the right places.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Two quick things before I pass over to Assembly Member Clark. One is, in terms of, we've now taken on board the adult education budget and responsibility for that. Will the responsibility for the climate budget extend through those further education colleges, subcontractors, etc.? I'm just thinking of the estates.
That would be level 2. That would be coming into the level 2 view, because they're independent organisations that we grant fund.
Okay, so it's
they're
the grant relationship.
they're not part of us, and we can't. And while we have funded some projects to improve certain facilities separately from AEB funding, obviously the AEB funding is there for people to get skills.
Yeah. I'm sure Enver's thinking about the challenge with those sorts of returns. And very quickly, is there a general thought about or direction of travel around further sort of ESG contracting ways of working? Sort of environmental, social governance, that sort of...
There is. That's why we're employing these specialists, because I don't profess to be an expert in this. My learning curve has been steep.
Yeah.
I'm just about holding down the language internationally with people in this, but the people we're employing are experts in ESG governance. That's
what I was getting a sense of. So this is a new
that team is creating that.
Yeah,
we have a head of green energy, I can't remember that, green investment strategy, and will sit under Luke Webster's team.
Yeah.
And they're already working on these governance arrangements.
And just to add, obviously, there's a whole lot of work we've done earlier around ESG in relation to our pension fund and our treasury functions, not just within the GLA, but obviously across the treasury function here, running the large part of the GLA group's investment processes as well. So there's a whole lot of work that we can happily, enlighten you on or write to you on in terms of the work that we've been done in that area on ESG.
I was saying to Caroline earlier, I've got through that nearly impenetrable Mark Carney book on it, so I'd be interested to see what we've done on it. Assemblymember Clark.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Obviously, it sounds like we're all on a steep learning curve, and it's interesting and quite exciting. I'm just wondering, in terms of your green finance team, it sounds as though you're recruiting people with expertise across the board. But when are you expecting that team to be at capacity?
The interviews and appointments finished last week.
Okay.
And people have got varying notice periods from 1 month to 3 months. So we've got 4 posts, 5 posts if you include the head of. The head of is already in post now. So that was an internal GLA group transfer. There were 4 more new posts that we interviewed for. And appointments have been made for 3 of them, and they've accepted. And the shortest notice period is 1 month and the longest is 3 months, which is why we've put WSP in already. Yeah. So we're not just reliant on those individuals. WSP are helping us set up the frameworks as well.
Yeah, so obviously, with the onboarding time, it won't be that long at all. That sounds really exciting. And staying with you, Enver, will reporting of climate change budgets be standardised so that all the functional body reports take in the same format?
Yeah, when you see the template, I'll forward you.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, it'd be helpful.
And it's not going to be easy, but we'd really like to draw a diagram of the glide path in terms of where the trajectories have been up till now, where the trajectory goes with existing what's in the budget, and what those extra initiatives are. So behind each one of those lines on the glide path, there needs to be a detailed completion of a template that's done exactly in the same way. And I think that's where the challenge, the little bit of pushback we're getting so far, because everyone's baseline is slightly different. But that's one of the problems in my job around the group, is to bring consistency in everything we do, and climate budgeting is the latest.
Yeah. And David Bellamy, what targets have been set for improvements to the climate change actions of the GLA and its functional bodies as a result of climate budgeting?
Well, that obviously will in some extent follow from the output of the first budget, because that will show us where we are. What, of course, both the climate budgeting, but more generally, the Mayor's focus on this means that functional bodies are working hard in terms of their own plans, and so that's what you'll see in the first climate budget when we publish it, is both a reflection of the work that's been done to progress things over the last year, but then also it will make clear what is still to be done, and we'll be then working with each organisation to find how they can do more. And that's where, as we say, we've talked about these staff, it is not just about supporting the climate budgeting work, it's also about how we support private finance, because while it would be nice for the government just to come along and give us the money needed for net zero, being realistic, that isn't going to happen. And so we need to look for ways to bring in private funding, as we're doing through the green bond, but on a much bigger scale. And so that work is going on, and you'll see more of that over time.
So yeah, but in terms of setting targets for improvements to climate actions, I'm just wondering how those will be set.
Well, I think that's the point about what Enver talked about in terms of glide path.
Mm-hmm.
Is like the key exam question, isn't it? Is right? Is each organisation getting to net zero by 2030? Yeah, and if not, why not? And what can be done about it? And then there's a secondary point, which is, well, right, what is the rate you're doing this at? Because it's like great if an organisation hits net zero by 2030, but we wouldn't want them to do nothing until 2029 and then magically flick a switch and be at net zero. We want to be reducing carbon year on year and years starting now. And so, it's understanding that glide path in order to say, right, are organisations moving at the quickest realistic pace they can, or are there things that can be done to speed carbon reduction?
Yeah, I understand. Thank you. I mean, being a Barnet councillor, I've seen what it's like to start at a standstill and then to really dive into it and see what quick progress we can make and sustainable progress we can make. So that's helpful. Enver, back to you. I'm just wondering what lessons. So you're obviously talking about having meetings with, other people in boroughs and also other countries. But what lessons will you take from approaches of other cities that already have a climate budget, like Oslo?
Oslo is the only one that's done it. We're the second city in the world to have incorporated it into our budget guidance. So we joined the pilots last, and we were the first to incorporate it into our budget guidance. So at the moment, they're sort of following me. So I'm speaking at a webinar. I was supposed to be speaking last week, but because of the morning period, we postponed it until next week. So I'll be explaining our lessons learned. The biggest lesson learned is about collaboration and widening in that as far as possible and involving as many people, because this can't be done with environment people and finance people alone. I spoke at the GLA Collaboration Estates Working Group last week, and even though we were speaking to each other functional bodies, some of the people on that estates group hadn't heard of this. So it's important to keep that engagement going and to talk to as many stakeholders as possible, both internal to your organisation and external. And what I'm learning from Oslo is, it took them 6 years and they did get it wrong. So I'm expecting to get it wrong. It's not a proud thing to say, but we've got to set those ambitions that we put out and be ready to sort of catch the net later in case what goes wrong and who did we miss off in that process.
And maybe, though, we will make some wrongs. Hopefully we won't make the same wrongs that they did and learn from those. So thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Enver, I completely appreciate that this is a learning process. And what I think, I think for the committee, we'd appreciate is could we get some regular updates on this? I think that what wouldn't be beneficial is if we just came back to this every 6 months or a year for an update. It would be quite good to get an ongoing narrative just so we can see how it's developing, and also to support you, because you are pushing into new territory. So it'd be interesting to see what you're doing. Right, can I congratulate the committee on being on time? And as it's now my turn to speak, I'm sure that's going to go completely wrong. David Gallie. Right. As we move to section 5, which is about the monitoring reports, the first thing that struck me is that the revenue income has been reported in the Q1 reports separate to the revenue expenditure. So why has that happened? Because that wasn't like that in Q4.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, this is obviously a development process. Essentially what we have now in our new quarterly reporting is it being driven from our new process with using TFL and improved SAP process. So this is a work in progress here. So there are all sorts of things that we need to iron out, which one of which is you spotted. We clearly need to refine this and work on it all. So yeah, and we need to integrate it as you describe.
Okay. So what you're saying is it's a working process. There's not been a decision taken because
no.
Actually, when we looked at that Q4 reporting, we did find some really interesting and meaty stuff to get stuck into. So I think the committee would like to see that come back.
Sure. Well, obviously, as I say, developing the report, it is constrained by the fact that we've got a cut-off point, and we were where we were with in terms of the development of that new process. So, if you can bear with us, then it will improve. It will, I'm sure, be able to meet the higher aspirations that we both want.
Yeah, and just to, as Assembly Member Duval was talking about earlier, I think what the committee really wants to see is that absolute as much transparency as possible, so we can really focus on performance. Net income position, I was looking at on the appendix, which is that the net income position for year to date is 233 million, and the full year forecast position of net expenditure is 212 million. So, talk me through how do I interpret that?
There are lots of lags going on here in terms of accounting adjustments. So, one of the things I'm keen to get the balance right. Obviously, you want to get be as transparent as possible, but also I think there's an element here where you're seeing, the paddling legs of accountancy rather than necessarily you're revealing anything about our performance going on. So I think there's an element of certainly some of the below the line items here, which are important for us in terms of ensuring that the income is ultimately posted correctly, as against ensuring that we are setting out to you the key performance issues. I think that's one of them.
Okay, so does that explain, because it looks like there's some sort of perhaps front loading on some of the actuals as well. Enver, yeah.
I was going to leave this one totally to David, but I don't think it's fair. The biggest item on that is the AEB line.
That's
so
where I'm
if you
going,
look
yeah.
at it,
Yeah.
The AEB grant of 278 million is front loaded.
Yeah.
And then it magically disappears at the end of the year, and that doesn't look right. No. So you need that swing. And the assumption from the AEB folks, as you heard when we came in July, is it will be fully spent. And so there's a net budget of 0.
Yeah.
But because that transparency isn't there through this latest report, you can't see the income and expenditure separately, which we need to fix.
Absolutely.
And if you'd seen the two items separately, you would see then that the AEB grant, which is up front loaded, is then spent through the year, and that you get that double swing where the grant disappears. So actually there's not that much variance elsewhere, but that AEB line is distorting it most significantly.
No, but as everyone here loves sitting down looking at Excel spreadsheets, looking at this, just picking up this data, it's difficult to see what that performance is. And I think when you go to the Q1 actuals around capital expenditure, that doesn't seem to balance up against the year-to-date budget either, does it?
Yeah, as I said, the issue I think we have is that there's this is at a snapshot of SAP taken at a particular time, and I think it's trying to get the right balance here between, obviously, we want to take the source data as it's shown on our accounting system to generate the reports, but at the same time, what this conversation is proving, I don't think it's very helpful necessarily to get into the sort of accounting mechanics that there happens to be a lag in AEB grant rather than as a real issue. I think it's somehow pulling out where genuinely there are performance issues. So, for instance, on the income lags, there is obviously a significant lag on domestic abuse grant, for instance, where there is a performance issue here in terms of ensuring that we can get the contracts going to get this service working with ourselves and MOPAC, and actually that is something that it clearly is, generating a lot of management attention to ensure it gets right, as against AEB. Well, actually, it's an accounting catch-up issue.
Yeah, so I think we really need to get this right quite quickly. Otherwise, as a committee, we're just going to be smashing big numbers together without a real understanding or appreciation of what it is we're measuring, which is performance against that budget. Which is.
So I think it's perhaps what would be helpful about it is if there's a narrative explanation of some of the apparently odd transactions here that show levels of variance. That then it gives a level of explanation in addition to the one we've given. That actually then focuses in more on, say, that distinction between AEB and domestic abuse.
Because on, sorry, go on, David.
I was going to say, just from I mean, I've obviously been around this internally through the years and trying to find the best way of looking at data, and I just think the thing to be mindful of in all this is that there's two reasons for having financial data. Essentially, one is about saying, well, right, can we pay our bills? Are we properly running things in a financial sense? And then the other one is it tends to use it as a proxy for performance. Yeah, and sometimes it's really helpful. Hang on, you haven't spent anything. Right, the project's late. Yeah. Other times you haven't spent anything. Well, no, it's just because they've given it, the government or whoever it is has given us the money early, and it's actually misleading. And the real art is getting into the discussions about performance on these things. And I guess that's how we have to think about how this committee can work with its fellow committees in terms of their work scrutinising all the range of things that the Mayor is attempting to deliver on.
I think that's right, and that's a conversation we started to have at the last meeting when we looked at underspends, which is when some of that money was dropping into the system, and it doesn't actually fit naturally with the budget process. So you almost get sort of heavily weighted funding at the end of the financial year, which results in an overspend, and then it rolls over. And then what we don't have, of course, because of the way that we do the forward planning, we have the year's plan set on a yearly accounting calendar, and so that the two things don't match up. So on that variance then, David, Gallie, we're looking at an 85 million overspend. Can you talk me through that?
Sorry, it's 85 million.
On the GLA line. It's a forecast overspend for capital and revenue against the original budget, 22-23.
So let me just get... I don't have that in front of me. Bear with me a second. Have you got that in front of you? So
so that's against the original budget, isn't it? It's interesting because we had a conversation last time about revised budgets and original budgets, and I think the forecast would only be, it would be 36 million overspend, but against the original budget, because the budget's been changed since the beginning of the year. So if you're comparing against the two, so what we've got is a situation where there was some ring-fenced capital money that wasn't in that original budget that's been carried forward because it can't be used for anything else, and that's been brought forward. That money, the additional spend, comes with additional budget that's put into reserves at the end of the year and then brought back down again at the end of the year, which you can't do as part of the budget setting process because you don't know at the end of the year what's going to be left on that capital scheme at 31st of March. So that goes back into reserves and then it's drawn back down again.
Okay.
And so therefore there's additional money. So the actual variance is more like £36 million against the revised budget rather than against the original.
So is this essentially getting to the end of the financial year, putting something in a drawer, counting it up, budgeting, and then taking it out the drawer again?
Sort of, yeah.
Okay, and so that's the...
It's carry forwards. It's carry forwards that have changed.
Yeah.
That have changed this budget effectively. So that's why David didn't recognise the 85.
So that's what. So it's a rollover figure, but it's been rebadged temporarily as something else.
And the thing I think to emphasise on the capital programme is that you need to look at it over the whole duration of the programme or the individual project to really get a sense of, is there really an underspend, overspend, as against there happens to be a slippage or there's an advancement of grant or whatever is driving that variance.
Which gets us to David's second point about that being used as a proxy.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. I understand. I do genuinely think maybe we'll have another meeting, and we have touched on this before, but how do we get these reporting figures right so the committee, and really importantly the public as well, can look at these figures, and if there's some narrative set against it, can somehow explain what's happening.
At risk of kind of adding additional technical detail to what is already a fairly dense technical report, I think where there are large material variances as the ones you've described, even if it is sort of an accounting sort of field trip, we will set out the explanation Enver's say given on the capital one now, so that you have confidence as to why that variance has occurred. But I think what I'm be keen to do is also, as part of the report, which hopefully you have in the Q1 report, is also focusing on, well, where are the real performance issues that you need to be aware of and scrutinise us on, as against perhaps things that are largely an accounting adjustment that actually, yes, we need to explain that, but actually shouldn't, doesn't have an implication for performance.
Okay. So just before I move on, so we dealt with the 17 million. There's still 15 million in terms of the revenue expenditure, forecasted overspend. And that's that. So you've got an original budget of 197.2 with a reforecast of 212.2. Actuals at the moment, quarter one, are 232.7 against a budget of 211.8.
Unless Enver's got the detail to hand, we're happy to give you a written explanation of that if that's easier. Unless Enver's got the detail to hand.
It's made up of lots of different numbers. It's not one single figure.
Yeah, because it's not revenue expenditure.
I mean, I think looking at it, one of the big things that you can see is that the actuals have a lot of the corporate movements in them. And so, which where you get into timing issues about things going out to LLDC, etc., that then aren't effectively in the forecast. And, what we've always tried to do in terms of how, certainly within the Mayoral team, we've looked at the GLA Mayor budget, is to try and keep separate those corporate items, because, if you're paying for a Crossrail or you're paying for East Bank, you've got some your Northern Line extension, you've got some very big numbers moving around there that can kind of obliterate actually what's going on in the GLA and what the GLA is actually doing. So we've always tried to try and keep that separate. And I think possibly what's happening in this report is that it's because it's given a whole GLA view, it's brought that in, and then that actually just confuses the discussion you want to have about what the GLA itself is actually doing.
I think that perhaps I could suggest that maybe I could work with Gino, because as David says, what this report's showing is a lot of where the GLA is effectively the accounting body for all sorts of wider group activity, which doesn't focus in on obviously GLA Mayor performance, but actually has an incidental impact. So it's perhaps finding a way that gets to a sweet spot where you are confident there's levels of transparency going on from our source financial information system, at the same time focuses on performance, and we try and get a better balance here. Obviously, I very much want to kind of demonstrate to you the complete information we have, but I think it's trying to funnel it in a way that is productive.
Yeah, and that we can all, we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
So that's what's useful. Okay, thank you for that. Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you. Enver, I love how you call it interesting, and I would call it confusing, but we'll agree to differ on that. How realistic is the anticipated full-year capital overspend, given that the delivery in the first quarter of 22-23 was £148 million behind budget? And what are the risks to recovering this under-delivery?
I mean, perhaps I could answer that question. I think the context we need to remember, this is Q1, and that in the last couple of years, the capital programme on housing has actually over-delivered against the approved programme, albeit that the spend has been generated largely from particularly the last quarter. So it's a historic pattern of spend, which at the moment doesn't give alarm signals going through. Obviously, something we're looking at closely. And our housing colleagues, as I say, performed over the last couple of years well on that, but it's something we need to obviously closely monitor and keep an eye on.
Do you think there would be a better way of reporting on this then? Because this does constantly happen and it is confusing, and if you're trying to look at it and make sense of it, it doesn't make sense.
But I think that's why you have a Q1 and a full year forecast. So yes, you have the real position at Q1, and you have what the plan is to deliver by year end, and there is inevitably a dissonance between the two, particularly in Q1, where it's often too early to make full predictions that are going to be sufficiently accurate.
So you don't think there's any other measures that would be more helpful to us trying to scrutinise in this respect?
But I think it does, exposes an important issue, which the bold numbers do, and you're right to challenge us about the confidence we have on the full year statement and hold our feet to the fire on that. I'm not sure there's a different reporting basis, because I think we need to have a regular reporting basis that is driven from actual numbers, and then looking at people making a full year forecast. That's a sort of standard way of reporting financial information.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I come back to what I said earlier, and this is to some extent, the numbers are a proxy for the actual delivery, whatever that may be, and that's where the dashboards come in terms of giving the the performance indicators and other information, and it's really about how the Assembly, through all its committees, does appropriate scrutiny of that. Because just taking the financial numbers on their own, doesn't necessarily give you a picture of performance, and it's certainly never going to. The numbers will not give you an explanation, and it's really it's the dashboards, and then having good conversations based on the dashboards that are the route to really understanding what's going on.
Yeah, I hear what you say. I just wonder if there's a different way that it could be presented, so it was easier for the public who don't have the opportunity of discussing anything with you, just so that they could see. Enver, the Q1 22-23 financial report shows European Social Fund first quarter expenditure was 9 million, but a full year forecast of only 1.5 million. So, A, what's that about? And B, how could the presentation of these figures be improved?
Again, perhaps I can answer that one, and they may have a bit more detail, but essentially it's this issue before we have a lag between income and spend. So the spend has occurred, but the income is to catch up.
Okay, more paddling legs of accountancy, as you put it earlier.
It's reporting.
I should remember that.
It's
I shall use that against you at some point.
I'd look forward to
it. Right, Enver. The forecast includes £5 million of expenditure for income maximisation that the Q1 22-23 report shows was not included in the original budget. So what will this expenditure exactly be used for? What does it hope to achieve?
So, in the efforts to improve transparency, our colleagues
forgive me for laughing.
Our colleagues designed a report that pulls some of the stuff which moves from the business rate reserve. So usually you don't see these transactions that happen straight out of the business rate reserve. So this income maximisation is an agreement. I mean, David will know because it goes back a number of years, but it's an agreement with the 32 boroughs where some of the council tax and business rates that's received is given back to the boroughs to use for initiatives that increases their ability to collect more council tax and more business rates. So they all get a proportion of that money and they bill us for it, and it's about 5 million a year, as you can see. The amounts vary. The examples I've got include, I don't want to go into too many specifics, but I've got some boroughs here where they've increased the size of their arrears teams and certain initiatives and how they track defaulters on payment, and that increases their collection rates in each of their boroughs. So it's basically giving them back some of what they give to us.
And do all the boroughs get that? Do they put in bids for it, or?
It started off as a voluntary scheme, and it's been one that's been proven to more than pay for itself. So what's happening here is, we are supporting borough revenue teams to maximise their income, and because they pay a proportion of their business rates and council tax to us, we get that share, and the additional share that we have gained over years more than pays that investment. So it started off as a voluntary scheme, but actually now all boroughs see the value of that process.
If they take on extra teams, though, that's a yearly cost, or do they do it on a year-by-year basis? Because, do they put them on their teams on contract for a year to see if they get the additional money back, or how does that work?
It would vary, but essentially this scheme is now well established, and so certainly from our point of view, we would want this scheme to carry on, continue, because it more than pays for itself, as I said. So, I mean, boroughs make their own decisions, I guess, about whether they would employ people temporarily in case the funding was to be withdrawn, or how they manage it all. Or indeed, I think certain boroughs use it as a kind of a hit team for one-off particular blitzes on, say, ensuring that their business rates properties are up to date, for instance.
Oh, I found that really interesting. Perhaps we can look into that.
Well, I think that's one of the areas where, you know, although it's sort of below the line and it's in the kind of the accountancy weeds, it actually has revealed, I think, an important development, an issue that we previously hasn't had your scrutiny, because I think it's one of the kind of the value, I guess, of showing more detail below the line in the GLA's accounts.
Yes,
there are also some there should be the mayoral decisions that approve this, and so there's more reading there for if you want to find out more.
no, it's interesting stuff below the line. We don't get to see. I just wonder how much there are. Are there any other similar expenditure plans included in the forecast that were not included in the approved budget?
Well, all the items are approved, as David has said. So the maximisation scheme is approved. The transfers, say, to LDC. So there's no non-approved schemes. But obviously happy to explain in more detail any of those other below-the-line items.
Okay, I mean, can you provide us with a list of those below-the-line items that you know that we haven't...
The list is there on that paper, but what I think we ought to do is to
to
provide a glossary at the bottom to explain...
That would be so helpful, Enver.
What these lines are.
No, and interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I have two members who want to come in. The first is Caroline Pidgeon and then Caroline Russell. Caroline Pidgeon.
Thank you very much. It's been quite an interesting discussion, because first of all, we've discussed the budget process and the flaws in that whole process because the timing's beyond our control and lots of things beyond our control. And now we're talking about the monitoring reports. And my question is to David Bellamy. David, you know, you've been in your role 6.5 years. And I recall in the first year or two, you coming to this committee and being very clear you wanted to get the performance monitoring right. We had delays in getting copies of those reports. You wanted to get the detail right. And you are a chief of staff like no other. You are over every detail, every pound, every penny the GLA group spends. Yet why are we still here today looking at a performance report that clearly doesn't meet all of our needs, probably doesn't meet all of your needs? You said earlier, I've been around this internally for years. Why are we still in this position 6.5 years later?
I think it's about organisational capacity to focus on this when so much else is happening. Would be the honest truth. We had one go at this in terms of performance reporting that led to voluminous reports that really weren't very much used, because then that's why I really kind of focus on the importance of conversations. I think, you know, getting the base facts and then having conversations like this is the best way of doing it. And I think, you know, we've gone to a second approach to the dashboards, which is good as far as it goes, but it doesn't really link to the bigger picture. And yeah, I've spoken informally to the chair about this, how we need to do that, and we are so, you know, having another go now, and we're going to try and define a consistent financial reporting package structure so that we can bring all that information through from groups in a consistent way, and, you know, try and think also about how we best report the performance data. And so, you know, it's something the trouble is there is no perfect solution about this, and it is inevitably complicated, and if you're not careful, you end up spitting out so much data to answer questions that you don't see anything, because you've just got an ocean of numbers in front of you. And so part of what we need, I think, is the right tools that actually allow you to say, okay, well, I want to look at the numbers in this way, and I want to look at, you know, I'm going to compare between budget and the latest forecast, or I'm going to compare between the latest position and where we were at the end of last quarter, and, you know, I'm going to look at a directorate level or unit level, or however you want to look at it. And it's, you know, I know a lot of work is going on in terms of the core financial systems in the GLA, which then will support that. And then Enver and I have started talking about how we then try and find ways of exposing that. So, you know, there's definitely more to do, and, you know, yeah, time and capacity is limited when we've got the climate budgeting to do on top of the annual budget cycle, but definitely something I would really want us to be better at.
Yeah, so you've talked about organisational capacity, you need the right tools. So what tools and capacity do you need to have a growth item in order to support this? Because how do you, and therefore you, assure the Mayor that you are confident of the performance of the GLA and the GLA group and the finance function in terms of making sure that we are on top of everything? Because it seems to me that you haven't got the information that you need, let alone us, and trying to carry out our duties to scrutinise it.
Yeah. So what we did was, I mean, I guess there are two budgets. One is the budget that we've got in terms of the modernisation of financial services, which is all about producing better reports more accurately, more quickly. And so that is a very important investment. The other side of it is, Enver's had a budget, and we had somebody come in and just do some kind of discovery work and give us some suggestions about, well, how could we take forward and improve our reporting? And that has just kind of, that initial phase has concluded, and I'm trying to pull together, I was to be tomorrow but I have to postpone it, the relevant officers from around the group, including the new Assistant Director for Digital who started yesterday, to really talk about this and get ourselves on the same page and talk about how we need to take it forward. And if we do need to put in a growth bid into the GLA budget process to do that, then we will do that and try and get it through against all the other competing priorities.
I'm sensing your frustration in this. You say you've been in the role 6.5 years, and I know you want the detail. I mean that's the sort of person you are, and you want to be on top of it. When do you expect us, therefore, to see a monitoring report that perhaps meets your needs and our needs?
I think that depends a bit on the implementation plan, and I believe in implementing things in incremental ways rather than going away and just for a long time in the shed and coming back going da-da. And that incremental approach helps get feedback. The question then really is, when do we get to the minimal viable product in terms of having something that actually is usable, not complete, but is accurate and performs a function? And that is something that we'll only work through when we start having the discussions that I was talking about, and we need to plot out the process for doing that.
So we're talking the end of this calendar year, the end of this financial year? Just give me a rough timescale, another year.
The only thing you're going to see, I think, in this financial year, materially, so within the GLA, is anything that comes out of the financial services modernisation project. There are other bits going on around the group. So MOPAC, now having a new police and crime plan, is looking at how it updates its monitoring report to really ensure that it ties in against the new police and crime plan, which is sensible. I know some discussions are starting about how we do similar things for the VRU as well. So we're doing that. We're not going to see any deliverable from the bigger picture project, because, like I say, at the moment that's unfunded and still under discussion. We're not going to see that this financial year, but I would love to have it for the start of next financial year, because I want us all to benefit from it.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. Assembly Member Russell.
Yeah, thank you. Just very briefly, I just wanted to go back to the income maximisation line that Assembly Member Hall was asking about. And I just wonder what safeguards there are for people. I mean, if this is about boosting collection of council tax and business rates. I mean, I know from my work as a councillor in Islington that there are growing arrears, however much work goes on in that collection piece. And for people who are on very low incomes, actually, if there just is physically not enough money, if you then start getting court summonses and things like that on top, that can be very, very stressful and add to people's experience of a very difficult period. And I just wondered whether there's guidance to councils that are involved in this work about whether or not they use court summonses.
I think it's probably worthy of getting a more detailed reply to you. But substantially, what we are doing is very much working with the right protocols on any arrears collection and any of the issues that you rightly raised that are sensitive in terms of people who are struggling to pay. So this is not a service where we are looking to support bailiffs going in, for instance, in terms of the some of the more controversial usages of income collection. I think it'd be helpful, Karen, perhaps if I could write to you around setting out some of the more detail. We do have in our briefing pack some more details about the individual schemes in the various boroughs that might be of help to you. So perhaps I can write separately.
That would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we move on to the last section of our questioning, which is around London Assembly funding, and Assembly Member Desai is going to kick us off.
Thank you, Chair. So a couple of questions to you, David, as Chief of Staff. So the pay rise for this year is 49% more than the additional budget provided to the Assembly for next year. How do you anticipate the Assembly will maintain its proper scrutiny of the Mayor when its budget is being chipped away? Do you seriously think that the Assembly can be expected to deliver on its role of scrutinizing increasingly complex areas of policy and spending with a diminishing share of the GLA group budget? And also, I'm really going to put this to you, what sort of message does it send out to the London public that the Assembly's budget is being cut, the very body whose role it is to scrutinize the work of the GLA?
Okay. Well, I mean, firstly, of course, the Assembly's budget hasn't been cut. Secondly, what was happening, and David, you might want to add more, was when the budget was set, was that the pay increase was held centrally because it wasn't confirmed what the pay award would be because it was still under negotiation at that point. And then that funding was to be made available across all the budgets of the authority. Yeah, and so therefore, now that's confirmed, my absolute expectation, and David can confirm if it's happened, is that the funding the Assembly needs to pay that pay rise should be coming across into your budget.
Yeah, happy to confirm, and I've obviously discussed this with Helen Ewan directly. So we treat the Assembly salaries budget in the same way we treat any of the GLA Mayor directorates. As David Bellamy has said, there's a corporate provision we've held for the pay award. That sum will be allocated. There is no short-changing of the Assembly's salaries budget, and it's treated exactly the same fashion that actual salaries are budgeted for in the same way for the rest of the GLA Mayor.
In fact, I was going to ask you, David, just to follow on from what you just said, that where will the funding for this come from? Unless, I hope I haven't missed anything, but...
Well, as I said, there's a corporate provision held for the pay award, pending that pay award being paid. As the pay award has now been paid, that sum will be allocated. Should be no issue around there being a salary shortfall in the Assembly.
Just to come back to you, David, David, Chief of Staff. I mean, the briefing paper that I have and my understanding of the situation regarding the funding of the Assembly is that there actually is a cut in our budget, equivalent to a 11% decrease in the London Assembly share for 23-24.
I don't understand that figure at all. The Assembly, I'm confident the Assembly budget went up. I'm just looking to see if I can find it now.
I think Assemblymember Desai, you're saying that it's actually the percentage share rather than the overall figure. Yeah. So from the starting position, it's reduced 11% from whatever the baseline is you're setting. Right.
Well, I mean, I think you've got to be careful with that analysis because the group budget will, as a total, will vary from year to year for all sorts of reasons. So, for instance, the completion of Crossrail will see a significant reduction in the group budget, and that wouldn't be an argument for reducing the funding available to the Assembly. So I don't think that there's an automatic correlation there like you suggest.
Right.
So do you think there's a potential correlation between the Mayor's budget against the Scrutiny budget? Should they rise and fall at the same rate?
So I don't necessarily think so. I mean, obviously there are certain provisions in terms of the law around the amendment process, but yeah. Question: if the mayor spends £1 million on the scheme or £2 million on the scheme, does that change the quantity of scrutiny that's required of that scheme? Yeah, and so it's it's that. Yeah, I guess it's that sort of thinking is about how do you set the scrutiny function up that's proportionate to the number of members and the capacity to provide scrutiny, because it stands to reason that the amount of scrutiny that members can do is necessarily going to be limited by member capacity.
So it's proportionate to the number of members rather than the amount of output.
I mean, it's gone. Obviously, the Assembly budget has gone up and down through the years. It's got, in general, I don't have the figures to hand, but we could dig out. But I know it went up, notably in through the mayor's first term.
It'd be interesting to look at some other models, but I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to move over to Assembly Member Hall. David, maybe you can give your answer alongside.
Okay, I'll be very quick. But what discussions have you had with the mayor about the Assembly budget for 23-24 and the longer term?
None at this stage. I think the position we are in was so we had a conversation here at your March meeting, and I think the ball was with the Assembly in terms of whether there were any proposals you wanted to discuss, and I said then that I was happy to do so, and that remains the case.
Okay, we'll look into that and come back to you. What is the Mayor's office budget expected to be for 23-24?
Well, we'll confirm that obviously through the budget that you get in November in the usual way. I'm not sat here planning lots of growth either in staffing or anything else. So I would have thought it would be broadly in line with where it is. But we'll go through those discussions and present it to the committee in November.
Okay, and how many functions which support the Mayor's office directly sit outside the Mayor's own office budget? And for an example, the Mayor's press office, which costs around £1 million a year, is part of the Strategy and Communications Directorate.
Well, I mean, I haven't got the breakdown, but surely everything in the mayoral side of the GLA supports the mayor directly. The cost of heating and providing electricity to this building supports the mayor directly. The provision of IT supports the mayor directly. The provision of policy advice, David's provision of step advice, the payroll system, it's all there. It supports the mayor directly. So, for me, it's not a question about trying to say, oh, should it be in the mayor's office budget or not? It's in the GLA budget, and it can be scrutinised on whether it's value for money expenditure or not, rather than internal management structures.
So his costing can sort of bleed out, whereas ours can't in that same way.
So we have two things. So the Assembly is an integral part, and its staff are an integral part of the authority. So when we take decisions, where the chief officer would take a decision about pay rises, for instance, we need to ensure that is handled appropriately across the organisation. Ditto to IT provision, where it's consistent across the organisation. What we have is different, is that the GLA Act provides that the mayor budget and the Assembly budget are distinct component budgets and are set differently. And so that absolutely is the place in law. And what we have to do, and what members have to do in setting those overall budgets, is ensure we have a process whereby everybody, in terms of staff, is treated equally in terms of pay rises, etc. And we have the mechanism to do so. And that's where we come back to Assembly Member Desai's question, and why we, rather than just saying, Assembly, here's a pot of money, we don't know what the pay rise is going to be, and you're on your own. It was held centrally and then allocated to ensure that everybody was treated equally.
So, I mean, could the Assembly members then use the Mayor's press office? Could that work?
Well,
if it's £1 million,
so
that doesn't come under his office.
So as I've said, I'm really happy to sit down and have some discussions. If there are functions where the Assembly provides a function within its own Secretariat Directorate, and there's an equivalent function provided on the mayoral side, and there's some efficiencies to be gained by bringing those together, well, I'm absolutely happy to talk about that. Obviously, that is done in many senses in terms of everything from IT to facilities to people's question time, a whole range of things where that happens. And if there are other things where we could usefully do that, whether that's relating to provision of briefing information or media-related functions, absolutely happy to have those discussions.
Yeah, this is quite interesting. You see, because there used to be the sort of the cost of the mayor's office, etc. Now you're admitting that it sort of bleeds away with an awful lot more. We know that the comms, as it were £1 million outside what is termed as the mayor's budget. Can you give us a breakdown of everything outside of his specific budget that is like the communications budget, so that we can get a good idea of how much this mayor is costing us? Because every single year the money goes up and up and up and up. The Assembly's money may not, despite the fact that we have to scrutinise a massive £19 billion budget. But it would be really interesting for all the Assembly members to see just how much this mayor is costing. So could you do that for this committee, please? I'm sure the chairman would be grateful.
I don't see how that can be done, because
really,
what you're really asking for is a subjective thing. So if you take the GLA mayor budget, you're asking to take aside the mayor's office budget and say, well, and then it's subjective. What is in that you want to regard as being directly for the mayor? So is the facilities budget directly for the mayor? Clearly, in law, the mayor has a responsibility to incur facilities costs for the Assembly. So clearly, not all of it is, but some of it clearly is, because there's electricity in the mayor's office.
Well, is there anything else that sort of bleeds out somewhere else that you can identify for us, or should we try and identify it for you? Give you the list and see if you can put some figures on it for us, so we get a true cost of the mayor.
Well, we absolutely publish in the budget and in monitoring information costs of units all through the authority, so we're transparent about that. What I would say is, yes, there are some things that I don't know about the press office, because that's all way before my time, but in terms of, for instance, government relations, that were counted as part of the mayor's office now are not, and that was for line management reasons, to give proper line management for staff that is not dependent on interruption by potential changes of mayoralty, and to reduce the direct management responsibility that I carry.
Okay, if I can help you.
It was about giving away responsibility rather than anything else.
Okay, if I can help a little bit, it's called the Mayor's Press Team, and it's in a directorate. Yeah. The Mayor's Press Team. Yeah. So there's a clue in that. So if there's any other areas that is the mayor's something, would you let us know, and would you give us the funding amounts for that? It would be helpful for us to know how much our mayor is costing, and for Londoners actually.
The reason it's called the Mayor's Press Team is for avoidance of doubt, because there's an Assembly one as well, and we have to differentiate between the two.
I think the funding differentiates quite considerably the difference between the two. You get my point. Could we find out, please, how much this mayor does cost us? Because we know it's going up in leaps and bounds, and it would be nice to know in which areas. And we'd be grateful for that as a committee. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
I genuinely don't get your point, but
I'll put it in writing to you, so to avoid any doubt.
That's what after the. Outside of the meeting, we'll follow that up with an email to see if we can get clarity on the request.
I mean, if you ask a defined question, we will, of course, happily give you a defined answer. I just can't get the definition of your question.
So we'll make sure that's followed up outside of here. I'm mindful of time. Assemblymember Duval had a very quick question, he tells me.
So it's completely different from the previous conversation. But one thing that's been missing throughout this conversation as we're using the mayor's budget guidance is an element of participation. We've talked about it before, in terms of budget participation elements of it. And I think the last time we probably had a conversation was about 3 or 4 years ago. And it's disappointing, institutionally, that we haven't moved off from it. So we have an opportunity here. We've all talked about this as a different budget post-COVID. We've talked about the importance of this budget, but there's the importance of our citizens understanding, and if in some cases, being able to participate in it. We heard very earlier on about the exciting agenda around the climate budget, and I think it could be, work in progress, but it could be quite exciting in terms of driving a particular range of activities for this issue. Can you give us a report back about what the participatory elements are, because you do some of asking questions of the public, and what's the plans? And given the case, it's not just for the GLA group, but what's the GLA family doing individually about explaining how their budget is spent in terms of delivering services? It's a mission, passionately I believe in the mission to explain. I'd like to go a stage further and see where we can have a view of where citizens can have a say alongside their politicians about some of this spending, but that's progress. But at this stage, can you report back to us of what your thinking is and what the stance is for the next meeting, if that's appropriate and the rest of the committee agree?
I mean, we can certainly set out what we have been doing in terms of engagement through Talk London and other avenues. I think the other thing actually comes back, Assembly Member, to the questions Assembly Member Pigeon was asking in terms of saying, well, actually, how do we clearly and simply present the information about the groups that people can understand it? Because it's inevitable with a budget of this size and the functions of this size and of the group and the different legislative requirements that we operate under and the different funding sources. It's inevitable that it is complicated, and you get for instance, in the MOPAC quarterly monitoring, there's an attempt, and indeed the TFL one, they try and set out, okay, this is our income, this is where it comes from, high level, this is where we spend it, as that attempt to do that, that little bit of an education piece from which I guess people are able to look at it and say, well, I'm surprised you spend so much in that area, or right, now I understand. And so it's, question, are we doing enough through the budget process to try and get that sort of stuff out there? And if we want to do more, well, is it best to do that in a kind of general approach that seems to regard people as understanding the entirety of a £19 billion budget and trying to ask them about trade-offs? Or are we better, as possibly you were kind of hinting towards there, about picking an area where we know Londoners will be interested and trying to get more focused feedback, and how do we involve them in that kind of input and scrutiny, I guess, process? So it's definitely worthy of thought.
I think that's really valuable. It's always a good pub quiz question to ask people if they know what the mayor's budget is, which I've been doing over this last year, and they're always astonished. So anything more we can do to help people understand that would be great. Look, I'm mindful of time, so can I thank our guests for attending this afternoon? It is appreciated, and for their answers to our questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
And to delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Feel free to go. We're just going to scoot through the rest of this business, and I'm going to have to speak fast. So agenda item 6, which is the Q1 group monitoring reports. Can I ask the committee to note the quarterly monitoring reports?
Noted.
Agenda item 7, which is payments over £250. Can we note the reports on
Noted.
payments over £250? Agenda item 8, budget and performance committee work programme. Can we note the committee's work programme for 22-23? 9, the date of next meeting of the committee will be held on the 22nd of November at 10 a.m. in the Chambers City Hall. I have no urgent business today, so that concludes today's meeting. Thank you, everybody.